Okay, thank you, Alina, for these succinct but very clear comments. I'll now hand over to you. I personally am not going to sort of use my power as a chair to ask the question, but I'm certainly keen to hear more about some of Sarah's the challenges that Sarah put forward in terms of broadening beyond the OECD some of these debates, and also how to work at regional level and not necessarily just at national level, which is something that I think is particularly interesting, and also some of Chuck's point about reconciling the development imperatives with some of the diplomacy and security issues at play within different countries. When you please ask a question, you don't need a mic because we've got this miraculous little thing here. We do. Well, we do for funnily enough, we do it just for us in the room. So please say who you are, and please pose very brief questions because it will be difficult for Sarah and Chuck otherwise to follow. Hopefully, even if you're sitting far away, they will hear you.
Hello, my name is Richard Brown. I just wanted to endorse what Sarah said, particularly about the use of experts coming in, building up a cadre from whether it's the US, UK, or anywhere else. And I speak from personal experience in Iraq, on where I've been on 3 occasions for over 6 months. The real thing that we started with a very top-down approach. That was the real problem, and everything that was done in Iraq was completely top-down driven. And the solution, when this wasn't working, which I found out, well, I thought it was going to, well, I knew it wasn't going to work from the start, but it became very obvious after 2 or 3 years it wasn't working. Then the approach came that, we need the purely military approach, or perhaps the project management approach, which was also adopted, is not the way to do it. So let's get some civilian experts in. But actually, a lot of them also came with very much actually a top-down approach. They might not have thought they did, but they did. But a very small experiment done in one particular area in southern Iraq, just on mentoring governance and helping them create their own budgets. Once they've empowered them, enabled them to create their own budgets, which they weren't able to do before, and therefore design their own reconstruction programs and development programs, you could almost lead them to it. They amazed us how they came in after a few months and showed not only analysis of where they'd gone wrong in the past, the Iraqis, but where they needed to go in the future. It was incredibly powerful what can happen if you approach it from this way. And just flooding countries with people, experts, is not necessarily the way to do it. And so I really, really endorse what you said on that point. And a lot more research needs to be done in this area before we march in with another top-down solution to these problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, please, can I remind everybody to be brief so all of you can have a chance to speak?
Hello, I'm Peter Owen, currently an individual. Could I... Ex-DFID, yes. Could I ask Sarah, I was very interested in what you were saying about Douglas North's ideas, that they've been around for a while in various articles and so on, and now we have the book. A very specific question. What do you see as the World Bank's role, and secondly, bilateral donors' role, in trying to bring about a settlement between elites in areas where it's either not there or unravelling? And can you give some practical examples of what the bank and donors might do differently in order to achieve that? For example, do you see scope for a role in peaceful contestation where priorities and distribution issues are being hammered out? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm pretty sure I mentioned, both of you have done it, but can I ask everybody to mention your name before you pose the question? Question 1, question over here.
Hi, my name's Ollie Housden from the Royal United Services Institute. I just wanted to ask about your point about getting regional actors involved to help with specific national problems. Earlier in the ODI series, it was mentioned that it was quite difficult to get larger neighbours, such as India, to help out with their smaller neighbours, such as in Nepal or Sri Lanka, with their insecurity that they were facing. I was wondering, in your experience, what mechanisms or actions have you found helpful to persuade sort of the larger neighbours to help with their smaller, more fragile, smaller neighbours? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, while you think, maybe I'll ask Sarah and Chuck to re-ask this first few questions, and then we'll see if some more are asked.
Thanks, Chuck. I won't say much here. I just want to echo one of the things that Sarah said about the role of the bank. I mean, I think one of the things, she mentioned the greater integration and work between the UN and the bank. I certainly think that's really crucial, is sort of marrying the diplomatic strategy that that UN and other regional actors have with the resources. And in fact, I think this sort of wealth sharing, asset distribution bargains is a huge issue. And on that also, of course, the World Bank needs to get on board with that itself in its own house, right? So that, you know, the hand of people who have approaches and awareness like Sarah needs to be strengthened, frankly, within the IFEs. The only other thing on the regional organizations, this is sort of one of the bits that Sarah mentioned obliquely. But you know, state building is not just about building states, and so state building can also mean, and it seems ironic to say that, but again, I'm going against the sort of, you know, we're going a little bit back away from the pendulum, away from the neglect of the state, which is, we also need to think in this, like, we live in such a complex world now in terms of authorities, in terms of sub-state and super-state and regional levels of authority, that the possibilities for governance are much greater than they were 20 years ago. And so our state building efforts need to reflect that, and particularly at the regional level in thinking about authority. And one of the reasons this, I'll come back to that, but we also need to think creatively at the sub-state level about authority and how that's strengthened, which is, you know, decentralization is part of that, and a very important part of that, I think. But each of these approaches needs to be, first of all, context specific, and secondly, you know, basically national, local actors have to be involved in decisions about where that governance is going to be most appropriate and strengthening. So let me say that. But the other thing is, we have ad hoc arrangements on particular functional areas of state functions that might involve private sector, that might involve coalitions of non-governmental actors and so forth. And one of the, well, anyway, so, but the other point that's related to this is how difficult it is, the regional organizations are important, is how difficult it is to do legitimacy building. And one of the implications that I didn't explicitly say that I say now is that my emphasis on legitimation, state legitimation, is in some ways a critique also of the overemphasis amongst some development actors on capacity building. Thinking that state building equals capacity building is not the right formula. And so, you know, capacity building must be married to legitimacy building, if you will. But it's really hard to do legitimacy building. And so I just want to echo Sir Kieran's comments also, that sometimes international actors just can't fix it, right? Because the constraints are really great. And those constraints include normative environments that basically empower sovereign rulers who, if they want to be exclusive, there's a limited amount you can do unless you use force. And we all are aware of the costs and risks of the use of military intervention in trying to solve problems. But another aspect of legitimacy problems is sort of this, this growing resentment of Western interference and intervention. And I think here regional organizations can play a very important role as legitimizers and creating consensus around certain kinds of standards of behavior that states should conform to. And in this sense, I think 50 years from now, as I tell my students, I think regional organizations are going to be playing a very, very important role as arbiters of what is legitimate and what is not. And I think we need to basically foster that and pay attention to that and shape that to a certain extent as well.
Alina, do you have some comments? Yeah.
Yeah, I just, one thing about the regional actors, I think again here, Latin America is a very good example. In the 1980s, Central America was, you know, completely torn apart by civil war. And basically it was a Central America-driven process that ended up bringing peace. And I think this echoes a little bit what Chuck was just saying. The United States, had gotten extremely delegitimized in the eyes of you know, a lot of the people in these different countries. And so it was an important thing that a regional dynamic evolved to actually find a solution. And eventually, you know, all these conflicts ended. So that's a good example. It's the Contadora group.
Okay. Let's have another round of questions. One at that end and then one here in the middle. Please say who you are.
Hello, my name is Elena Perez, and if you allow me, I would like to make a minor point on the case of Colombia. As Sarah said, indeed, homicide rates have gone down dramatically, and this is, of course, very important. But since it's at times been done using questionable means, there's an ongoing scandal about extrajudiciary killings, and more broadly, undermining previous settlements as the Constitution and guarantees for political opposition and the separation of powers, and in broad terms also undermining Colombian democracy. I was just wondering if, or I'm just extending an invitation to further debate the Colombian case, to take and not to take what the government says at face value, if Colombia is going to be used as an example of good practice. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Michael Walls from the Development Planning Unit at UCL. I want to push you a wee bit harder on what you're meaning in practice when you talk about we all agree that top-down processes are overused, and when they're overused they can be highly problematic. But the alternatives are not so apparent. My experience is in the Somali context, and amongst other things, the local indigenous peace building and state building exercises that have taken place there. And the Somaliland example stands out as one in which, partly because it is so antithetical, so much the opposite of what has happened in Somalia, where there's been so much external intervention, so much top-down and every other version of state building, and yet the Somaliland one, through very little support from outside, has managed to achieve remarkable success, although still faces many challenges. Does this not in practice suggest that we should be looking at an even more radically different approach to international engagement in peace and state building than we're even talking about now?
Thank you.
My name's Eliza Nyangwe. I work at the Guardian newspaper. I just wanted to ask a really quick question about who holds the international community to account when it becomes apparent. I know Chuck made a point about sort of ventriloquism, that the involvement of international agents actually aggravate the problem and aggravate conflict. So who is monitoring those who are meant to be monitoring conflict?
Thank you. One at the back. Lenny?
Hello, Lenny Wild from ODI. I've been quite pleasantly surprised by how much agreement there seems to be across the panel today, particularly around the importance of questions of legitimacy, accountability, and more inclusive political settlements. But it also seems like there's a lot of agreement that we don't know how external actors can really help states get to those issues. And I've recently been doing some work looking at support to political parties, an area which remains quite or relatively neglected by donors, particularly in comparison to their support for civil society organisations and so on. And it seems to me that political parties, can play key roles in peace processes and so on, but also as actors in political settlement. So I'd welcome the panel's thoughts in whether and how donors should be seeking to strengthen work with actors as politically important as parties themselves.
Okay, I'll throw in one last question before handing over to the panel again. My question is about aid. And as we see bilateral donors like the FID planning to channel a significant amount of aid to fragile states, I wonder the extent to which the aid effectiveness agenda, and it's not so much in its principle, but is in architecture and the focus on PFM systems and national budgetary processes, how much that can be reconciled with the need that you expressed to look for more regional engagement on the one hand and the importance of subnational processes, even in terms of determinants of conflict and instability. So back over to the panel for the last round of answers.
2 minutes.
Yes.
I'll go first. I'll start with the last question that was raised about how to get international actors to help. I think Sarah's better positioned to answer this, but I just want to address, I think that the first answer to that, and the most important answer, is one that echoes what Sarah said, which is to marry the development resources with political strategies in the hands of diplomats. It is not for development actors to develop new programs to do political and governance stuff. the first and most important answer is to defer to those who are basically facilitating the diplomatic elements that are facilitating these processes. And so I think it's important the development community get that, frankly. And that doesn't mean that these programs are not important, okay? I'm not saying that they're not, because they can be. In particular, I think that dialogue programs, again, I'm going back to the other issue, which is how do you basically how do you make sure that opposition figures and insurgents, after an election is held, the losers of an election continue to be, potential spoilers continue to be part of the process. And related to that is this issue about organized crime and combating organized crime that is a major threat to stability, security, and peace in these situations. And there are many programs that development actors can undertake in shifting in that direction. Sarah can probably say more about that. On the Colombia issue, I'm going to also, I'm very uncomfortable to hear Colombia being held up as an example of success. But from a metric, I was in Colombia 2 years ago with Human Rights Watch doing some consulting, and it was shocking how much reduced the violence is in Medellin than when I was last there. It was, at the same time, there's no question that this is largely because the government is in cahoots with paramilitary groups, and it's to a certain extent launder these paramilitary groups in ways that are very antithetical to principles of justice. So that certainly we have greater security. In some sense, many people feel like it's at the expense of justice. And I think that, this is an interest, there's certainly very positive things that have come out of the Uribe administration that I would not have necessarily predicted and that I think are good things from the last 6 years. But at the same time, I would say, yes, I think we need to make sure that we keep the eye on justice and other priorities at the same time. And anytime we talk about the success of the Colombian case, we say, but at the same time, there are major questions. And some of those things may be resolved in time, right? And so this is one of the things that I thought we would see in Afghanistan that we did not see. And so I've been proven wrong. But I thought justice issues about human rights atrocities committed by warlords would within 5 years come around. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. And so, it's a complicated question of what we see. In terms of who holds the international community to account, I think that it's very difficult. No one holds the international community to account, largely. So, and that's the truth. And it's unfortunate. And I think that the international community needs to try to hold itself more to account. And there's certainly true that Southern voices are increasingly calling for that. And I think Southern states in the Global South, as well as media, both Northern and Southern media, need to play that role as well as non-governmental actors. And we need to find ways that, again, I go back to transparency. Like, transparency is the first step in accountability, and greater transparency on the part of international actors is an important step that I think still there's more room to be had there. I think the question that Mike Wells raised about more radical approaches is a very good one, and I don't have an easy answer to that. But I do, many of my colleagues in the program on peace and conflict resolution in America work on non-state initiatives with women's groups and peace building. And I think one of the things that I find is this great gap between those of us who are sitting in this room, or those rooms, if you will, having this conversation, and those who are engaged in sort of local level dialogue and peace-building efforts. There's a firewall practically between those efforts. And U.S. Institute of Peace is actually one of the few places where they really try and engage both of those in a single institution. And I think more efforts in that direction actually is one thing that we should think about. I don't think it's going to resolve the problem very easily.
Okay. In that case, as we're running a little bit late, I'm of course not going to attempt to summarize the key points, and we will have a summary posted online in the next few days of this very rich discussion. I've got a couple of special thank you for this particular meeting. The most important one, I guess, is for our IT teams and technical teams at ODI at the bank, because I think this worked really well, and it's certainly something that we're going to look into doing more for the future. This series is funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we're very grateful for the opportunity it's given us to explore these issues around fragile states. And then finally to this panel, who has animated, I think, a very rich and interesting discussion. Thank you all very much, and see you all on the 2nd of December for the last meeting.
Thank you.